Welcome again, everyone, to Decarcerating Care, the Evolution of Mental Health Surveillance. Just for a quick visual description, my name is Jessie Roth, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. And for a brief visual description, I'm a white woman with dark brown hair and glasses. I have a big bun on top of my head, dark headphones, and I'm wearing a black shirt, and I have some houseplants behind me, and there's a little light coming in through my window. And it is a great honor to welcome you all here to the 5th installment of this ongoing talk series that we've been doing. And I'm going to just start with a few brief opening slides so we can go ahead and get started. We can go to the next slide. So just a couple of quick notes on accessibility. We have live closed captioning available today. You should be able to click the closed caption button and view captions at the bottom or top of your screen to turn that on. We also have a team of ASL interpreters joining us, and whenever possible, we aim to provide visual descriptions for access as well. Next slide, please. On tech, we have a team on tech support. So if you have any questions, Sun is there in the chat. You can reach out to them. We are also, as you can see, recording this event to share with registrants later. We really want to invite you to join the conversation in the chat. Feel free to share your thoughts and reactions as we have this conversation, and also to share any resources as well. We won't necessarily be able to answer all of the questions that come up, but we always save them, and we hope to engage with them beyond this evening, including to inform any other panels that we organize in this series. Next slide. Just a few quick words about the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. Who we are is a community of current and prior mental health service users and survivors, a community of social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other clinicians and activists who have all come together to transform mental health care. And what we're doing here at IDHA is advancing critical, effective, and scalable alternative approaches to mental health through collaborative education and community development. And what makes us unique here at IDHA is that we are integrating experiential and academic knowledge, challenging the idea that only those who work in the field of mental health are the experts, shifting power dynamics in a system that generally only privileges professional experience. Just a few brief community agreements for this evening. The first is shared expertise and wisdom. Everyone brings their own expertise to the conversation. We can all gain from and respect each other's various expertise. Collective liberation. Overcoming oppression aids everyone's liberation. It is our responsibility to challenge various forms of prejudice. We educate in the spirit of solidarity and hold each other accountable without criticizing who we are as people. And lastly, listen like allies. We respect a wide diversity of choices and perspectives, even when we disagree. And we don't judge or invalidate each other's experiences. So just to give you kind of what to look forward to this evening, I'm going to pass it in a moment to our moderator, Selima. We'll have introductions from our panelists, and then we will go into a discussion and a Q&A. So with that, it is my honor to introduce you all to Selima, who is our moderator for this evening. Selima is an IDHA member, and I'm really excited to hear from her and then from all of our lovely panelists who will be introducing themselves shortly. Thanks again so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, Jessie. This is Selima. Good evening, everyone. My name is Selima Jumarali. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a brown-skinned Indo-Guyanese femme person with round cheeks and black curly hair. I'm wearing an emerald green top, big gold earrings, red lipstick, and behind me is a gray wall. I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate in clinical and community psychology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm calling in from the unceded land historically stewarded by the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples, colonially known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my honor and pleasure to serve as the moderator for this evening's conversation with this group of beautiful hearts and brilliant minds. both our panelists and all of you tuning in this evening. I enter this space with deep gratitude and warm reminders for us to hold each other with compassion, care, and abundance, and for each of us to continuously check in with ourselves and take what we need as we need it. I also enter thinking of all of those resisting oppression around the world, particularly the queer and trans and women activists of Iran fighting for freedom and bodily autonomy, as well as those resisting ongoing occupation and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. Welcome officially to the 5th installment of Decarcerating Care, a discussion series born in 2020 amidst the ever-evolving COVID-19 global pandemic and soon after the racial uprisings in response to the police murder of George Floyd. As Black organizers and activists called for the defunding of police, IDHA launched this discussion series and joined the conversation critiquing the notion that we should replace cops with care, raising awareness of the historical and present-day harms of the psychiatric industrial complex. I'd like to extend appreciation to the IDHA Committee of Organizers and staff and interns who've worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Gratitude also to everyone supporting with tech, logistics, to our interpreters, and to our captioners tonight. Tonight's theme is the evolution of mental health surveillance, where we will expose and unpack the pernicious shape-shifting of carceral logics of control, confinement, and disposability within the mental health arena. Psychiatry and psychology have wielded the medical model to spread the myth that the natural diversity of our minds and bodies are differences to be categorized and assigned value. This myth is leveraged to uphold the white supremacist capitalist hierarchy and establish false binaries of good and bad, healthy and ill, normal and deviant or pathological. These false binaries teach us that people on the wrong side of the binary can be discarded or disposed of, whether in jails or prisons or asylums. But we know the truth. Humans are dynamic, resilient, and responsive. And what the medical system may call symptoms, some of us call normal and natural responses to living under oppressive forces that limit our self-determination, interpersonal connection, and social, political, and economic freedom. Tonight, our spectacular panelists will review the historical roots of mental health surveillance and their inextricable ties to white supremacy, capitalism, and ableism. They will expose present-day iterations and manifestations of mental health surveillance to help us all sharpen our critical analysis and differentiate reformist reforms from true abolitionist practice. Finally, they will uplift ongoing resistance to these harms and ground us in centering liberation and healing as we translate tonight's learnings into action. Again, we encourage you all to engage in this conversation by using the chat to share your thoughts, feelings, and reactions, as well as any resources for continued learning and collective growth. It is now my pleasure to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. A friendly reminder to please name yourself before speaking. For example, this is Selima. And I invite you to share your name, pronouns, your visual descriptions, and a bit about how you're feeling about rising surveillance and carcerality in the mental health system and how this relates to your work. We'll start off with Azza.
Great, this is Azza. It is really great to be here. I use she, they pronouns. I am a Black femme presenting person wearing a green cardigan, a light colored t-shirt, and a pink floral print scarf. I have tortoiseshell pattern glasses on, and visible behind me are some art prints and my bookshelf. By day, I am a senior policy manager at a movement support organization. I am a MAD disabled organizer and strategist. And lately, my work has focused at the intersections of disability justice, carceral abolition, and labor organizing. And so those are the perspectives and experiences and kind of domains of struggle that I'll be drawing on today. And with that, maybe Selima, could you, apologies, as I am again having the same issue with my computer, if I can go on mute here and just quickly try and address this and then come back on.
This is Selima. Please take your time. I'll pass to Teal to introduce.
Hey, this is
Hi.
oh. This is TL. Selima, I was actually about to, I think all of us are trying to get grounded. I was going to ask you again to just like slowly repeat the question.
This is
Thank
Selima. Absolutely. So for introduction, just sharing your name, pronouns, and visual description, and then how you're entering into this conversation. What are your feelings about the rising surveillance and carcerality in mental health? And how does that relate to your work? Give us a brief taste of what's to come in the conversation this evening.
Okay, this is TL. Briefly, I am a Black gender fluid person, pretty gender neutral presenting today with my favorite Black sweater, which comes up my neck, has lots of different materials, Black beanie, and seafoam colored shirt under it. I'm seated on a couch in front of a white wall, and I'm on unceded Tongva land. I am queer, Black, multiply disabled. I am an abolitionist, social justice engineer is the best way I can explain it. I'm a community attorney and organizer. I co-founded an organization called HERD, which is an abolitionist organization that focuses on supporting deaf, disabled, incarcerated, and all forms of incarceration folks. I may or may not talk about that at all today. Like the specific work, it depends on how things kind of go about. And how am I entering this conversation? I have like so many things on my brain that it's hard to get one thing out. And that's because we're dealing with what I call the medical carceral industrial complex, and like the connections between all of these sites of control, surveillance, and incarceration are impossible for me to separate, as it so too is impossible for me to separate how ableism influences all of our lived experiences as marginalized people, and how all of us experience the grunt of ableism regardless of our disability status. So I will be talking a lot about that. In particular, Black, Indigenous people, regardless of disability status, are detrimentally and impacted by ableism. So I think I'll be talking a little bit about that. And I think that gets to what you had asked us. Go ahead.
Thank you, TL. This is Selima. Next, can we have Yana introduce?
Hi, everyone. This is Yana. My name is Yana Kalu. I am an olive-skinned genderqueer person wearing a nose ring and a Black kind of like bowler hat over dark brown curly hair that is short in the front, long behind, and I'm wearing a mustardy shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a bright yellow door and a gray wall. And I work at a crisis hotline that is divested from police, and I'm the director of advocacy there at Trans Lifeline, and I'm leading our Safe Hotlines campaign that's aimed at getting police out of crisis hotlines. And my experience as a non-binary and light-skinned mixed race Brazilian American person informs how I approach movement work, and my experience of going through mandated reporting as a child, struggling with mental health issues, both personally and also as someone who was involved in my father's mental health crisis that involved police and involuntary psychiatric hospitalization, really, I think, informs my work and my commitment to abolitionist crisis support that doesn't rely on this infrastructure. I'm just really honored to be in learning and organizing community with all of you today. And I hope to just help connect some of the ways that carcerality and surveillance have been constructed as care. Particularly, I want to share some of the ways that we're seeing surveillance, policing, and the denial of agency operating in the crisis hotline landscape, as billions of dollars are really being spent on new federal infrastructure for this. And specifically around crisis hotlines that engage in non-consensual interventions, which means the sending of police or other emergency responders to that caller's location, but without their knowledge or their consent. And I'm joining y'all tonight from unceded Lenape lands known as Brooklyn, New York.
This is Selima. Thanks so much, Yana. Next, Idil.
Ooh, good evening, everybody. My camera's on. I'm Idil Abdillahi. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm very thankful to be speaking with all of the brilliant speakers this evening. So thank you very much. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Black woman with a bald head. I am wearing pretty dope square black glasses, like one of my other panelists this evening, who also has dope glasses on. I'm wearing a headset, so I have earphones on and small silver earrings. I have on a taupe lipstick from MAC, and I'm wearing a black hoodie, and I have a necklace on. It's a gold necklace, but you can't see the pendant, but the pendant also says my name, IDIL. I'm sitting with a blurred background on a black chair. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 13 in so-called Canada, Toronto. I'm an educator at Toronto Metropolitan University. I work in the School of Disability Studies, and I am cross-appointed to the School of Social Work as well. I guess just to briefly respond to your question, Selima, thank you so much for it. I feel essentially like a sense of urgency to respond to this particular question. Often, as I think some of my other panelists have already discussed today, is that there is a seemingly disparate conversation for many people around care and carcerality. But for me, the discussion is actually one that is about carcerality first, that then goes on to sort of think about how we discipline, how we contain, and how we confine people through ideas of prescribed pathology. So these conversations for me are interlinked. They are connected. And ultimately really have a kind of foundation around social order, discipline, control, loss of autonomy for individuals. So I come to this conversation, firstly, as a Black woman who has lived and been through these spaces, who has worked with individuals, who has survived these spaces personally, and now is really beginning to think about how we truly begin to frame decarcerality in the context of ultimately like prescribed pathology for particular kinds of people, Black people, queer people, trans people, working class people, so forth. And so today I particularly want to think about those ideas and really think about how fundamentally it is the control of those of us who are living with mental health issues that are not identified, so forth, that are seeking to be controlled. And so to me, I think the sort of bigger kind of picture here is one about carcerality and containment, and not so much one about care. And I think that it's really important for us to kind of undergird this framing of this conversation in that, in the apprehension of livabilities, in the containment of lives, and ultimately in how it is that we think about how care manifests in the context of those who are most impacted by some of these discussions. And so I come to this conversation this evening with these ideas in mind, and hopefully to kind of speak about them as they reverberate through multiple systems, and not just ultimately the mental health system, because many of us don't come to that system without first being engaged in another system. So I sort of want us to think about the continuum of these kinds of carceralities across lives, and also then how they manifest on different bodies and different lived experiences differently: Blackness, transness, compounded disabilities, indigeneity, etc. So this is Idil, and I'm done speaking for now. Thank you.
This is Selima. Thank you so much, Idil. My heart is reeling from what you've shared. Last but definitely not least, Shauna.
Hey y'all, this is Shauna Murray Brown. As a visual description, also wearing dope frames as described by Idil, blue rectangular-esque frames, red lipstick. I'm a Black woman, so brown skin, twisted hair coming down to my right side with a tan shirt, a white curtain in the background with a peak of my favorite color, yellow wall. I am speaking from Piscataway, Conway, unceded Piscataway, Conway, a land also known as Baltimore City. And I'm really, really happy to be here. I am coming, having been trained as a clinical social worker, having practiced as an integrative psychotherapist, both in private practice and juvenile detention, and residential treatment, having been an organizer here in the city of Baltimore, and being a healer and a person that sits at the feet of my elders to contend with the realities and the wisdoms of the African spiritual traditions. I am really probably going to talk about a lot of things, but the things that are coming up for me right now are really this intersection of this experience that I find myself often having to hold space for other people to bring together the personal and quote unquote professional. That is, this conversation brings up for me urgency and breath simultaneously, right? And urgency, what comes up for me is the stories of my brother, my mother, my father, all who have somehow or another either been killed as a result of carceral systems or are struggling with substance use and abuse as a result of harms done by the so-called mental health, so-called justice systems. But I also come as a person that holds liberatory healing space for Black women and femmes in leadership, navigating the in-between, the radical intersections of trying to do liberation work while working in systems, and also holding space for those that are mental health practitioners, our human service professionals, our administrators, our organizers and wellness activists about what it means to decolonize therapy for Black folks. So I plan to bring all of that, but really zooming in on what it can mean for us to provide and to move through the world from a liberation-focused healing perspective, to give some voice to some of the both and experiences of those that are working in the system, but are from our own community and have, very unique experiences, and just giving light to some of the things that I think are often left unsaid. Happy to be here.
This is Selima, just taking a deep breath in after that. Thank you so much, Shauna, and to all of the panelists. As you all know, over the last 2 to 3 years, we faced multiple pandemics, a range of social uprisings, political and economic crises, and other cataclysmic social changes. In this time of the past 2 to 3 years, what has most salience for you in terms of how it's impacted you, your movement work, or your community, whether it's a particular event or dynamic? So to repeat, what has the most salience in terms of how it's impacted you, your movement work, and your community? This is to everyone, so anyone can start.
This is Idil speaking. So I'll just go ahead and start from my particular vantage point. My camera is off, so I'm just going to say that for visual description. So there's an image of me that is a image of me on a Toronto subway with my hand on my head and a scarf, green jacket, my bald head, my lipstick. So that's what you're seeing on the screen. And I'll quickly answer the question. I think for me, speaking from the so-called Canadian context, around the issue of mental health in the last 2 years, that resonates with me particularly. For many people, I think that George Floyd's death is a particular marker. In fact, it's not just a particular marker, it's an international marker, it's a global marker. And for me, living here in Canada and living in Toronto, 2 weeks before George Floyd's murder, actually, I'm going to call it a murder, that's what it was. There was also the suspicious death of a Black Indigenous young woman named Regis Korchinski-Paquette, that the country that I live in didn't apprehend, take up, make urgent in the same way that they did George Floyd's death. Now, Regis Korchinski-Paquette's mother called 911 for mental health support for her daughter that day. She ended up dead off of a balcony. The family, the community is still awaiting information on what actually happened that day. Subsequently, after, we had the well-known murder actually, of George Floyd in Minneapolis, of which the world had a particular kind of response to, including Canadian institutions, Canadian organizations, Canadian corporations, statement after statement, after acknowledgement of Black death and Black life that was distant. A few weeks after, we had also the death of DeAndre Campbell in our city and in our country. These are all Black people. Prior to that, we had several other deaths that were also connected to calls to 911, calls to police. And so for me, there are two simultaneous things happening. One, which is the acknowledgement of Black death that is global and interconnected and will always be. And then there's also the refusal of the local. Or to quote a colleague and a scholar, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott, who writes in Black Like Who, something happens here, meaning in so-called Canada, where we live, that Black people die here, that Black people are shot and killed by police here. Yet for some reason that death does not resonate. Yet for some reason, the death of Black people living here and now and in this place and in this time doesn't appeal to people particularly, sort of Canadians in the way that we discuss the relationship between Canada and the United States. While we know these borders are fictitious, something is happening here. And what's happening here is there's also, unfortunately, a particular kind of racist prioritizing of death, right? Of imperialist kind of American focus on death, mental illness, that isn't taken up in a way that it would happen in Berlin, of which I was there recently, and also heard about the deaths that are happening rapidly there of Black people living with mental health issues. Okay. So for me, what ends up happening, or the impact for me, is to actually really think about, one, how do we take up the rapid deaths of Black people across borders, across globes, because it is happening everywhere and anywhere? How do we take up the fear of madness, the fear of difference, the fear of disorderliness, the fear of the unknown, especially in the context of the Black body, in the context of the refusal of kind of unlivability, the interruptions that happen when people don't know what's happening to their family member, when we are uncertain about who to call and how to call, right? These are the kinds of first resonance that I have in the way also that we value different lives and spaces and places and communities, etc. The other sort of impact that the last 2 years have had on me has also been the uptake of conversations about, quote, madness and mental health that have really come up through the context of a kind of neoliberal discussion of a contextual kind of pandemic, right? Of which has really left out and left behind those of us who this is a consistent reality. This is a clinical kind of, to use that word, I know that one of my other panelists, Shauna and Yana and Aziza and TL have spoken about, right? That we are all working within systems that also kind of acknowledge a particular kind of appropriate madness or mental health illness, one that is maintainable, manageable, right? One that's brought on by something we all experience, right? Not one that is our sustained life. And so I worry about the kind of watering down the neoliberal, right? Ultimately, I don't know if I can say this here, but the effed upness of this new kind of romanticized mental health and mental illness, right? That many of us, this is not what many of us and those that we support are talking about. And what's the impact of that? And as we sort of see this uptake, new discussions about mental health, this kind of opened discussions about mental health, it's important for us to know, right, that the carcerality that brings us to this conversation today is likely not the folks that we're talking about. And so I want to really kind of inject, and impregnate us with this discussion this evening. So I'll leave it here. This is Idil, and I'm done speaking, and I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
This is Selima. Thank you, Idil. Would anyone else like to respond or build off of Idil's comments?
This is TL. I'm conscious of time, and I know that this particular question was meant to be an entree. So I want to share just briefly a lesson learned for myself, coming to you now from my identity as a former long distance runner. One of the things that we learn about is the critical importance of pacing. Pacing not just in the individual race, but also in various aspects of the race, and then also in our preparation for the race, and then in our just general existence, right? Like as a runner, you're a runner all the time. It doesn't pause because you're not actually running. And so therefore you have to be mindful of your presence, your body, mind, everything, almost at all instances as a runner. And so I think for me, it's acknowledgement of the freedom struggles that we are presently in, and that our ancestors kind of handed off to us, is a generational marathon. And our role in the struggle is just our role. and to maintain perspective on your place in the grander struggle is really important. Also, the critical importance of organizing in a way that acknowledges our humanity, our interdependence, our what I call love hyphen rage, like it's like so close together that it's almost difficult to disconnect. Love, rage, love, and then joy. So leaving space and acknowledging humanity, interdependence, love, rage, and joy in our organizing. Because the work, when done in earnest and in a principled way, has an impact on the people moving the work. And it's important to acknowledge that. It's also important to think about our organizing in ways that leaves maps with azimuths. Azimuths are the specific directions where a person might need to go or avoid to find their way home or to find their way away from danger. So we want to leave maps with azimuths and instructions and meals and jokes and musics and warnings and art. So that way, if we, the person speaking presently now, gets tired, the next person doesn't have to start from where you began. And also keeping in mind that you can lose your memory during the work. So part of acknowledging our humanity is recognizing that you won't be where you are all the time, and that people need to be able to find you wherever you might be. Yeah, so someone has to be able to come along, share a secret word to convince you that they're on your right team, and help you find a way and others find a way to the finish line, which is right on the horizon. Thanks.
This is Shauna. I really I had to look at my notes because I just got so much going on. I have so much going on. I have to look at my notes. It's cool though. That is what paper is for. So a few things that I want to put at the fore around what's most salient specifically is really in alignment with what my two colleagues panelists have already shared, but it's specific to the role, the positioning, and the consideration of those who consider themselves human service professionals, therapists, and the like. And so there are a few things, and one is a very common conversation or statement that is expressed by folks in the field of social work, of therapy, of healing, and the like, the quote unquote helping profession, is that I just want to help people. And it is totally appropriate for us, having been socialized with a particular way of viewing what help can look like, to stand in that path. However, I think that it is important to consider that working within institutions alone is not going to get us to our liberation. And so one of the underlying things underlying on my list, I'm looking, that I think is important to contend with is that there is a difference between social change and social justice. And I say this, anyone who has ever heard me speak before for longer than an hour has heard me say this, right? That social justice usually exists within the confines of a system. It is palatable. It is, the usurping of whatever the grassroots community has identified as necessary work, and then the watered down version within the institution and the state. And so village building, relationship building requires us to shatter the separation of the personal and professional to a certain extent. It requires us to stand on that line. And so I say that to say that alliance building and reconnecting with yourself as a person and community, or in alignment with what TL just articulated about the importance of honoring your own humanity, is super important, right? So if you are somebody's therapist, somebody's social worker, but you don't have any grassroots connection with the folks in them in your locale, my question to you would be, who are you working collectively and collaboratively with if you don't know your people, right? So that's the first thing. And so organizing and positioning for actual power building, so that when we are in communal space and we're doing radical imagination, where we're imagining what things can be like, we're playing this inside outside game. Cool, cool, cool. I'm going to write the notes as sparsely as possible, and I'm gonna do the connection, the heart work, and the deep communing with the folks in community. And the last thing that I'm gonna say before I sort of pass the mic is the importance of not only embodiment to be able to access radical imagination. So I had to take a bath before I got on to get myself back in my body and with the reeling that often goes inside of me. And also this critical consciousness raising around like what having the eyes to see. How do we cultivate the eyes to see what is actually in front of us? And instead of, you know, ruminating on what's happening on our phone, on our screens. And this is Shauna, and I yield.
This is Azad. There's so much that's coming up for me right now. One thing I want to just start with, I so appreciate what you shared, TL. And I have to name, I'm so honored to be on a panel with TL, who's one of my movement teachers, close friend, comrade, and who has taught everything that they just spoke to through example and words. So just deep gratitude for those lessons. One of the main learnings for me over the past year and change has really come through COVID being the extraordinarily catastrophic event that it's been, and the mass death and mass disablement that it has generated. For those who know me well, you've likely seen differences in how I move and how I speak, because I'm one of many people who is disabled by long COVID and trying to figure out what that means and how to navigate this new embodied experience. And one of the primary kind of ways that I have come to understand how these systems operate together is the fact that so much of the way that we distinguish between disability and like what constitutes disabled and what doesn't constitute disabled as far as the state is concerned is entirely tethered to one's productivity. If someone can be exploited through their capacity to perform wage labor in this very routinized and time-regulated way that the labor market is organized, then your disability status is like not really all that germane, right? Like all that the state is concerned about is accumulation of capital. What is the capital? What is going to serve the interest of capital? If it can be served through exploiting you as a worker, that's how they're going to do it. And so the moment where your disability starts to be something that cannot be accommodated or shaped or fit into this routinized way that labor is organized, those people are shoved out of the labor market, where they are either institutionalized and become sites of extraction in service of capital in those kinds of settings, or pathologized and incarcerated, where they become sites of exploitation in service of capital. And so those structures of confinement and incarceration are themselves as much tools of class war and ableism and anti-Blackness as are the ways that people are facing the threat of death and violence in their workplaces, and why we are seeing such a huge kind of resurgence of labor militancy in this moment. So it calls on us to really confront the fact that disability and ableism has to be central to any analysis of class struggle, has to be central to any analysis of what it takes to completely and totally abolish capitalism, address the undergirding structures of anti-Blackness that form the basis of the systems of mental health, carcerality, and surveillance that we're all gathered to talk about. And so I think those sorts of connections and how enmeshed those structures are became especially clear to me, and especially radicalizing for me as I've been navigating COVID and long COVID in my case in particular.
Thank you so much, Azza. This is Selima. If you can see in the chat, people are feeling what you're saying. The energy is rising. And I want to turn it back to you to kind of ground us in what are some of the present day dynamics that echo these historical roots of surveillance enacted against MAD, neurodivergent, and disabled people, just to bring us into how do we be very clear about those parallels so that TL, as you were saying, in this freedom journey, we're not starting from the beginning when our ancestors have already done some of the work. We're building off of that. So again, if you could just comment on present day dynamics that echo historical surveillance.
This is Azza, will do, and will also note sometimes the pace of my speaking fluctuates, so please feel free to let me know if I'm going quickly for interpretation and just for access reasons. I appreciate y'all.
Pause. This is Selima. I see that interpreter Aaron, deaf interpreter Aaron has their hand up.
So it's just a reminder to watch your pace and make sure that you're breathing into your words. Just makes it more accessible, not only for the interpreters, but also the folks listening in as well.
This is Selima. Thank you for that reminder. All right, please go ahead, Azza.
This is Azza echoing that gratitude. Thank you. So to restate that question, kind of tracing those historical roots that help us understand the context for the structures we have today. So I would start by first understanding the history of the development of medical authority and confinement in this country, because they're very entangled, right? So if we go way back to the systems of chattel slavery, that is one of the first kind of systematized structural places where you see a few things happening. One, you see medical authority being used in order to justify and legitimize this brutal institution of chattel slavery. So folks may be familiar with quote unquote diagnoses like drapetomania, which was a manufactured description of an illness by someone named Samuel Cartwright that claimed that Black people are predisposed to be enslaved and in servitude, and if they had drapetomania, it would make them want to escape their confinement, and that is disabling. And so as a consequence, people were really using kind of medical authority as a way to try and justify the systems of oppression that were used to extract labor through violence, through brutalization, right? And then even after chattel slavery is like formally, for the most part, legally kind of ended after the 13th Amendment is ratified, you still see that sort of practice. And so it's reproduced and it's replicated. And so what you start to see is that the development of medical authority being entangled with using these captive populations as a way to develop their understandings of kind of medical diagnoses and how to form diagnostic criteria. And so that sort of understanding, I think, is important for recognizing the ways that hierarchy within the medical industrial complex is originated and reproduced, and how it's entangled with the forms of repression and the forms of sanism, and ultimately the kinds of mass tools of surveillance that seek to encode and embed that sort of social control function over people who are marginalized. The other piece of this that I think is important too is the dimensions around labor that I was talking about earlier, because you also see both during the period of chattel slavery and immediately afterwards, the development of something called quote unquote work therapy and the development of work therapy happening at the same time that you also begin to see these this shift towards work as punishment, right? So I think there's a lot of research and understanding that people were kind of moved into what was called a convict leasing program, right? And how that was such such a contributor to the mass incarceration of Black and brown, poor, disabled folks who were in many ways even more vulnerable in a convict leasing program because people who are incarcerated are being leased out, their labor is being extracted, and they had no incentives to care at all about their well-being because they had a consistent supply of labor through this program. On the other hand, there is also the development of these big kind of asylums that are becoming mass warehousing institutions for anyone whose behavior was deemed as not normative, anyone who's engaged in struggle that threatened the status quo, anyone who is more on the margins of society. All of these people start to be in huge numbers institutionalized within these asylums that start to implement what are called work therapy programs, in which people would be forced to labor, and that labor would be described as having a therapeutic quality to it. And I bring that up because folks may have seen, but there is recently an investigative project done by Reveal that looked at some 300 currently operating today programs that are quote unquote drug treatment facilities for people with substance use disorders, that as part of that program compel people to labor uncompensated. And they describe that labor as having therapeutic value to justify their confinement and that form of extraction for profit. Some of that labor is done to maintain the institution itself, much as what we see in jails and prisons. But a lot of that is actually done through contracts and used by Walmart, Avalon Bay, for folks who might be familiar with their kind of capture of housing, and other really big companies, ExxonMobil. Many of them are the beneficiaries of labor extracted from people confined within those sorts of institutions. So what this sort of reveals is, one, how people are subject to these kinds of forces of incarceration, confinement, brutalization in service of capital, how the development of medical authority in this country is entangled with that, so that people within that system become agents of a broader effort by the state to exert control over marginalized groups, and particularly Black and Indigenous body minds. And how today, the kind of expansion of surveillance technologies and the way that carceral logics are reproduced well beyond the walls of jails and prisons is just the continuation of that history. And so as we think about and as we are engaged in struggle, abolitionist struggle and principled struggle, we have to contend with that past in order to make sure that the kinds of organizing and interventions that we're pursuing today do not simply replace one kind of authority for another, but instead totally transform our conditions, build power in our communities, and create systems and networks of care that are not built in hierarchy, but in interdependence and a recognition of each of our inherent value, and our recognition that those of us who are most impacted have wisdom and expertise that should be valued in the development of these sorts of networks of mutual care and aid.
This is Selima. Thank you, Azza. I want to invite us all into a breath after what you just shared. Yes, we need to contend with the past. And I want to pass now to TL to talk a bit about the links between ableism, racism, classism, how they play out in the mental health system present day, and how communities are resisting.
Hey, this is TL. I'm trying to figure out where to start. I'm going to start where I didn't want to start from, but I want to give concrete examples first to help people actually associate the theory with like, what are we actually talking about? A lot of this is from the past, but I get into eugenics is present. So bear with me. I want to invite people to pay attention to the similarities, connections, and overlays between Black codes, Indian removal and Indian appropriation acts, Jim Crow, public charge laws, unsightly beggar ordinances, anti-vagrancy laws, and convict leasing and Vendu systems, Vendu spelled V-E-N-D-U-E. I'll drop a link in the chat because it's not a word that we actually use very frequently. One moment, please. I only have access to host and panelists. I'll ask you all to just share it beyond. I also want people to pay close attention to the interchangeable and often indistinguishable sites where those people targeted by those laws and systems inevitably find themselves, often cyclically so. For example, plantations, which were prisons, pens, P-E-N-S, also like where animals were held, humans were held, stockades, privately owned and operated homes, houses of correction, i.e. jails and prison, poor houses, workhouses, poor farms, homeless shelters, asylums, county infirmaries, prison hospitals, reservations, boarding and residential schools, again, in quote, orphanages, and even in the military, among other places. While the stated purposes of these institutions and practices always include a positive spin, for example, aid, treatment, cure, rehabilitation, correction, discipline, vocational skill development, vocational skill proving, and the list continues. All of these spaces are carceral regardless of their euphemistic name or stated benevolent rationale or claim. And if we want to rhyme, and anybody paying close attention could peep the game, right? It's clear. The people in all of these places that I just named, with the exception of, I think, the military, used to be called inmates in those spaces. The laws and the practices and the geographies and conditions of these purging places make it clear that the aim has always been to maintain control over valueless, surplus, ungovernable populations and land to expand and protect white settler colonial power and capital. So that's where I'll begin. Now I'm going to come back to my other beginning. In America, quotes, and it's not capitalized, people have come to understand most everything through a lens of whiteness, wealth, colonial and imperial power systems. And that is what makes it very easy to dismiss and difficult to see oppressed people's humanity. And I talk about humanity a lot. And humanity is particularly relevant here because so much of what disability actually is just humanity. And so much of what ableism is a humanity heist. Heist, if you don't know what that means, it means theft. Theft only of certain people's humanity, though. Only of those deemed undesirable, unworthy, Black, Indigenous, uncivil, and so on and so forth. But what I'll say is that the maintenance of perpetual inequity and domination, such as we have experienced on this stolen land, requires a very comprehensive, nimble, and timeless approach. It has to prioritize, normalize, commodify, and obscure ableism and eugenics. And to that end, settler colonizers have found an immortal accomplice in ableism. This is an ideology and practice that does the following 6 things for the interpreter's sake. Continuously otherizes and devalues people and communities. Creates dominant groups and subjugated groups. Pits dispossessed and subjugated communities against each other. Moves undetected and unnamed through and across communities, spaces, often confused with or named as some other oppression altogether. It's leveraged to justify widespread preordained inequity and violence. And it can be used to justify any and all manner of commodification, pathologization, criminalization, extraction, and exploitation. And I'll wrap up because I know I'm close to time. I have to figure out what the last thing is that I want to share, and I think it'll be this. One way to think about ableism is as having what I call a pathocriminalizing function. I put together the word pathologizing and criminal or criminalizing. You can switch them if you prefer, if it rolls off your fingers or hands or whatever better. But I use pathocriminalizing function in our societies, specifically settler colonizing capitalist societies. And the function of ableism in our societies is to nullify, objectify, and problematize, in other words, thingify oppressed people to distract from the actual problem: capitalism, imperialism, authoritarianism, oppression, impoverishment, and the list continues. Ableism fashions the distraction that Toni Morrison warned us about, that keeps its objects perpetually clamoring toward an everlasting one more thing to prove that they are not nothing and that they are not everything. They are just human. Ableism compels the timeless and hallowed and haunting chorus: ain't I a woman? I am man. Black lives matter. Ableism is why Baldwin's equation rejected ableism when he told young students in 1963 at the high school where his nephew, who he wrote his famous 1962 letter to, he said to them, "The measure of one's dignity depends on one's estimate of oneself. It really does not depend, as so many in this country now seem to believe, on someone else's estimate." So with that, I think I might pause and invite someone else to share. Thanks.
This is Selima. Thank you, TL. That was a word. I'm just breathing this all in. and feeling it in my body. I invite us all to do the same. Thank you. I don't think you could have put it, anyone could have put it better, that ableism is a humanity heist, a theft. And there are so many ways in which these past dynamics continue to cycle and recreate themselves into present day iterations, like you said, to assert control and uphold white settler colonialism. This pathocriminalizing function that you're describing makes me think of how mental health care is considered to be expanding and increasing access and hiding the function of also increasing surveillance and control. So I'd like to ask Yana if you could speak a bit about how the rollout of 988 is an example of a broader pattern of services that, you know, purports increasing access, but still leads to confinement, control, and surveillance.
This is Yana, and thank you, Selima, and thank you, TL. As soon as you said that patho-criminalizing, I just thought about the ways that suicidality enters the state penal codes, and the way that an individual mental illness, rather than seeing something as a normal response to not having livable conditions, becomes both criminalized and pathologized at the same time, right? Super helpful framing. Yeah, I guess I want to say that, like, first, that 988 is billed as this effort to separate out mental health calls from 911. And I don't think that it's not well-intentioned to get care to more people, but like what that care is for a second is something that we need to think about, number one, because the answer to like just getting cops and 911 out of mental health response is not forced care that's predicated on racialized and gendered and class and ableist notions of mental illness anyway. So I think before we just dive into like the carceral surveillance and privacy concerns with 988, I just want to name that the mental illness model has just needed, it's like relies on ignoring our pain, and it relies on ignoring that suicidality is that very normal response to not having what we need to be okay culturally, spiritually, financially, emotionally, and they've needed to ignore and deny that response is normal in order to be able to subjugate and treat us as just unwell people who are just like deserving of access to treatment, and to say that stigma is actually the problem, right? I think the field of suicidology is a place that really, really uncritically produces and maintains sanism, because I just see over and over the ways that lived experience is repeatedly tokenized within just a suicide prevention landscape, where users of crisis services are just unreliable narrators and doing any kind of research on survivors' experiences of non-consensual interventions. It's like, well, they were in a crisis, and so they're, they don't know actually what was happening, or they can't actually, say what this experience was like for them, right? Which is really opposite from centering survivors experiencing and demand what we really want to happen and what we deserve to happen when we need support. So I think 988's overall practices are very much in line with all crisis hotline practices in this country. And the transition to 988 is important because of the funding that's attached to it, but it's really just created a new number for people to call, and rather than overhauling a system, right, and funding for that number. But the system that exists relies on non-consensual interventions. It fits into the system of trying to get people more care without focusing on actual prevention, and it carries out the state's paternalist response to saving lives, which means somebody else gets to decide what a crisis is, what risk is, what what immediate danger is rather than you. And it means a 72-hour hold. It means ER visits people can't afford. It means forced medication, many of which, when applied involuntarily, have been shown to increase suicide rates in the year post-discharge. So suicide prevention is not prevention. It's a patchwork of institutional responses that happen after the fact that don't get at why this is happening and actually make this worse. And I do want to say that at Trans Lifeline, we struggle with the same thing that other hotlines deal with, which is there isn't infrastructure and emergency infrastructure in the US that we can actually rely upon. And so that lack of non-carceral emergency infrastructure isn't crisis hotline's fault. I believe that all of crisis hotlines, irrespective of their affiliation with police, want more emergency resources to support their callers with. But in practice, 988 is not working to begin divesting for police and 911. They're actually cementing that relationship. So if they wanted to divert calls from police, they would not be doing what I'm about to tell you that they're doing. They're not working to end the harms that surveillance of Black and Brown communities causes. They're actually expanding it. There's no such thing as a non-consensual intervention on a crisis hotline without surveillance technology. So the capacity to geolocate a caller is key. You can't send a cop to someone's job or school or home or location if they don't tell you where that place is, unless you figure out where they are without them telling you, right? So once somebody else defines the crisis event itself for you, and imminent risk is defined by somebody who doesn't know you, who's not in your community, who's not connected to you in the ways that Shauna was talking about, and who has expertise that is taken away from the person actually experiencing it, this is what is happening. And I want to clear up the confusion about the use of surveillance technology on 988, because I'm watching crisis hotlines complain about all of the misinformation out there circulating about call tracing and geolocation. And they're like, we don't do this, we don't do this. But crisis hotlines have actually brought that on by themselves due to their lack of transparency about the issue. So currently 988 and crisis hotlines like Crisis Text Line, Trevor Project, they're not geolocating callers themselves, but they do geolocate callers through the process. They engage in non-consensual interventions that rely on geolocation. If they choose to engage this, the hotline, the crisis hotline you're calling, 988, whomever, they provide that phone number or that IP address if you're chatting for support instead of calling, with the 911 public safety answering point, so the 911 center that corresponds with that area code or IP address. But all the talking points are we don't geolocate, right? What's important is that this year 988 has actually requested the expansion of the same surveillance technology as 911. You can watch the FCC hearing that happened this May, in which the heads of 911 and 988 claim that 911 is actually preparing for increased mental health calls due to 988. And the head of 911 across the country claimed that 988 and 911 are married, and 988 does not exist without 911. But all the public talking points are about how this is diverting calls, right? From mental health calls from police. Our concerns about the data and the use of that data, and the privacy and the surveillance, with literally one nonprofit getting the expansion of 911 surveillance technology without any kinds of stipulations or oversight about how that location data is going to be used, and without letting callers know that that is happening, is pretty terrifying. That request is still sitting in the FCC and Congress. It hasn't happened yet, but what's happening right now is that crisis hotlines are claiming to not geolocate while still doing so in partnership with 911 and not being transparent about the fact that they've actually asked for it. I also want to thank the work of Rob Wypon, who's a Canadian journalist who's done a lot of the work on the transparency, on transparency of lifeline calls that go to 911 and police. And what's frustrating is that this is a federal taxpayer, this is a taxpayer funded program, right? That isn't actually letting us know how that money is being spent and how many calls are going to police each year. So across crisis hotlines and tech services that utilize non-consensual interventions, we're seeing these logics of saneism used to remove the agency of people seeking help. And agencies claim that transparency about those surveillance practices would discourage callers and stop people from getting help, right? That's the reason for taking away that transparency. We must listen to people who have survived those interventions and what they're saying about what is actually helpful and what is harmful. And we need a definition of safety that is an abolitionist definition of safety that understands the very clear harm and lack of effectiveness in carceral, medical, and criminal interventions. Our current infrastructure of 911, EMS, fire, police-led crisis intervention teams, mobile crisis teams that just take the psych assessment to you and then force you into psychiatric hospitalization. This is what is justifying broader surveillance to non-consensually intervene faster, right? That's not what we need. That's not what trans people are saying we want. That's not what people of color are saying we want. That's not what disabled people are saying we want. And then burying that information continues to erode this trust that the help we seek during crisis will actually be supportive. I think that 988 funding could play a key role in demanding some emergency infrastructure that does not rely on police and forced hospitalization, and that those funds could actually divert calls from police if they're not working together by funding crisis support that does not utilize police instead of further entrenching that partnership with them and expanding the use of police surveillance technology for their own operations. We can demand a model of suicide prevention that starts with putting money into people's hands so we all have a safe place to live, free healthcare that centers our agency, good food, good water, and supportive schools. That's what makes people have lives that we can live. We at Trans Lifeline started the Safe Hotlines campaign during the pandemic to really center this vision, very much inspired by the work of Black organizers who mobilized after George Floyd's murder to lead movements to defund police departments and abolish family policing across the country. And after 2 trans people this summer were murdered by police within weeks of each other in the midst of so-called mental health crises, Maddie Hoffman and Aaron Lynch. We're really interested in centering survivors and listening to the experiences of people who have been non-consensually hospitalized, because the logics of saneism don't allow those narrators to be reliable. And if you want to share your story of experiencing a non-consensual intervention, or if you want to sign the Crisis Caller Bill of Rights, demanding the kinds of safety and agency and transparency that you would want during a time of need, you can find all of those links that are being generously shared. And part of the learning that we're doing this year is studying more about survivors' experiences about this. So if you want to participate in a paid study on help seekers' experiences also with non-consensual interventions or experiences using crisis hotlines, you can also do this. And I'll put in my contact information so people can get in touch. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yana. This is Selima, and I know Yana from this study that they're just describing. We really want to learn about people's experiences, and I will also be doing my dissertation study on the psychiatric hospitalization experiences among LGBTQ people of color in hopes to advocate for the need for alternatives. So I think this is a perfect segue to turn to you, Idil, to talk about the role that academic institutions and research can play in expanding surveillance and control, and how these academic systems intersect with others to reinforce the carceral state.
Thank you so much. a great question. So I think there are a few prongs that we have to take up, right? And I think one of those first prongs for me is the idea that in general, I think students who are experiencing mental health issues and or other disability related issues, one, have to register and let an institution know that that is their lived experience in order to get access within the classroom space, right? And so I think about that for me, again, in the context of being in so-called Canada and what that means in sort of like an institutional academic relationship, right? And I think for me, and I think probably for many kind of like disability justice scholars and sanism scholars and people who support individuals that are living in those situations, what we all know is that ultimately not all of us have the same access in order to request access from an institution, right? So if you have a history of being one of the people that Azza described in the history of mental health, from the foundational kind of perspectives of both pathology, race, to go into what TL then described around class, broader ideas of ableism, to then go into the responses that Shauna described in terms of how practitioners respond, and then to go into what Yana described in terms of the community kinds of responses, right? And so when we think about all of these relationships, it is also based on a particular kind of disclosure of a health status that institutions ultimately don't require, right? So if we think about, just from the vantage point that I speak from, again, in the Canadian context, in Ontario, in Toronto specifically, there are particular kinds of like legislative and policy kind of initiatives that suggest students shouldn't have to disclose certain things in order to get access and space in a classroom. Pardon me. And so when I think about sort of the first kind of relationship with academia, I think about how do we treat the individuals that show up in our spaces in our classroom? How do we let them know that they are allowed, that they are supposed to be, and that the spaces that we garner in order to teach them how to quote, like Shauna described, quote, help other people, right? How do we enact that, or how do we embody that in those kind of educational and teaching spaces in a way that is actually fundamentally helpful to the broader well-being of individuals? And that means queer, trans individuals, Black individuals, Indigenous individuals, people living with mental health issues, so forth, right? Because what we know ultimately is that institutions are here to police, to discipline, and to have people act and respond in spaces, places, and ways that we expect as appropriate. So sort of from the kind of like front end position, I think about like what we expect students to do to get access in a classroom, which in and of itself is extremely colonial, extremely carceral, and problematic. And then I think about the other pieces around all of the disciplines, the psych disciplines, social work, psychology, occupational health, etc. I can go on, right? That nursing, right? Nutrition, that tell us that, racialized people, Black people, fat people, poor people, people who don't have access, right? Are the actual pathology that we are supposed to correct. These are inherent, again. So I want to go back to what Azza described as poor houses, as if you are not able to be a kind of commodity within systems, what that means then for the systems who are supposed to produce how we understand the individual. So when I go then into the idea of kind of research, right? Ultimately, when we're in these disciplines, we're to correct, right? Like the idea is we're to make something better. We're to make people whole, to make people not being unwell. And so when we think about the kind of context in which our studies are designed, the expectations is that we're looking to find some kind of cause and effect, right? So if we give you the 988 or the 119 number for example, in the Canadian context or other contexts, right? That we assume that that is supposed to sort of alleviate or do something differently. So I think about, for example, I'm just gonna touch really briefly on some of what Yana said, which isn't the academic piece, but I think it's important to speak to. Which is in the Canadian context, we talk a lot about, well, we spoke about post George Floyd, like what do we do with these kinds of calls? And what people talked about was redirecting those calls to mental health service providers, except the call was still a 911 call, right? And ultimately, it is the police who gets to determine the risk and the severity of that call. So if a person is having a mental health call and there's a weapon involved, for example, irrespective of who you call, if there is a knife involved, if there's a pair of scissors involved, if there in fact is a plastic fork involved, that is a 911 call, regardless of having called the other number. Not only that, but historically, in the Canadian context, these aren't new numbers to call, right? Because ultimately, like Shauna described, social work outworks itself all the time. It has peer workers, right? Which in and of itself is its own problem. The Academy also helped to create the idea of a peer worker. I think that's really important to talk about. Also because the peer worker is never the person with the, quote, worst clinical diagnosis, right? So on the screen, I'm using air quotes with my fingers, right? It is not the person that has particular kinds of criminal charges, quote, right? Which allows them then to be a participant in society in a particular kind of way. And so when we think about the Academy, what we think about is remedies to academic problems, disciplinary problems, and not life problems. So when we come back to what's the issue on some of these calls, ultimately, like I spoke about earlier in the introduction, which was, how do you feel about the response to kind of carcerality and mental health in this time, right? My response to that is that ultimately, I feel like what we have to think about ultimately is what happens when we are asking individuals to respond to mental health issues, yet that's not actually what we're asking people to respond to. We're asking people to respond to a kind of out of orderness, right? To use a kind of Caribbean term, out of order, rankness, right? A kind of madness, right? That we don't, for many people, Black people, queer people, Indigenous people, trans people, we don't understand these things as everyday life responses to what's happening around individuals. What we do rather is say, what is it the pandemic that is causing this? Is it a particular kind of life experience, like one life experience that's causing this? Do people want to end or complete their lives by virtue of something horrible happening? Or like I talked about earlier in their introduction, are there some of us that live passively with suicidal ideation every day for all of our lives, right? And so when you're living passively every day with suicidal ideation, every day in your life, that would mean for many people living with mental health issues, every day you are having a 911 call. In my context, in the Canadian context, of which suicidality is illegal. It is a criminal offense, okay? So every day that you feel like I can't go on any longer, and you call, whether it is 119 or in Yana's case, 889 or 988, right? The idea of that is there's still a particular logic that says you should not be having this particular experience that you're having. And so how do we take up the kind of ails of social and political life that then have us make those kinds of responses? And then what happens in my mind, right, is what are we tallying? What is the data that we're collecting? Are we collecting the data of the call to the 988 or the 119 or 911, right? Or are we actually collecting, assessing the impact of the pain and the trauma that individuals are feeling that lead them to making that call? And so when I talk about, as I did earlier, the kind of prescription of pathology, right? The prescription of incarceration, it is the everyday life of those of us who are toiling and experiencing a kind of trauma. Okay. And beyond that, sort of from the community perspective and what academics are kind of assessing and collecting, tabulating and calculating, right? They're collecting often the kind of like neoliberal interventions to what these experiences are and not the reality of what those experiences are. Because if they were, then what they would say is, ain't nobody want to call 911. Nobody wants to call 911. Right? If your cousin and your sister and your mother and your brother and your partner actually could contact another number and not have their entire embodiment and life and everything taken apart, then they would, right? But it is those of us who kind of are still, not kind of, who are being seduced by these ideas, right? By these kind of ultimately reformist ideas that we are all here on this call seeking to refuse. We don't want these things, right? Because ultimately, wanting to end your life can get you a sentence. In my context, in the Canadian context, that's important. I want to keep inserting the Canadian context. I think it's important, right? But that's the thing, right? So when you call for support for your family member and they end up dying, when you end up seeking support for your family member and you're scared because you don't know what's going to happen to them, the truth is that call is going to lead to incarceration, less the things that my panelists have already talked about: class, race, intersected ability, ableism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the response to the academy, I think a part of us has to actually acknowledge the kind of carceral and pathology relationships across all disciplines and fields, right? We also then have to acknowledge the way in which the academy also reproduces its own police, okay? Because now in certain institutions, you are supposed to report your colleague when your colleague comes to work unkempt, when your colleague is disorganized on the job, when your colleague is appearing to kind of exhibit these behaviors. So now what we're doing is we're also normalizing a particular kind of carcerality, right, in these interactions. And we know where those end up and lie. Those lie with people whose hair can't rest back or be flattened enough, people who don't smile enough, people who are rude, people who look different, people whose gender expression lays different and lands different in those institutions, right? So I see the 1 minute. So I'll let it go forward, but ultimately we don't need any more data. We don't need any more data. We know what happens to people living with mental health issues. We know what happens to Black and Indigenous people. We know what happens when people end up being incarcerated in these systems. And what we need to think about is why we demand more data while people are experiencing damage in their everyday lives, right? We have the answers. We need to do something differently. And that's the actual urgency that's before us. So I'll end there. This is Idil and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Idil. This is Selima. All of that, I'm so sorry to have to call time. There's so much more I want to hear and want us to talk about. And I also want to make sure we get to Shauna to bring us back into, like, yes, you're right. We don't need any more data. The information is there. We have known this. This information has been passed down for generations. We do not have to rely on the white supremacist written word for it to be true. And so I want to pass to Shauna, someone I've learned from, to tell us more about what liberation-focused healing looks like.
This is Shauna. Thank you. I am full. Like, I was over here writing copious copious notes, and I will be taking my breaths throughout because I do speak fast. So I will occasionally, you'll see me just pause to get myself together. So it's a few things that I would like to share. And so I'm going to put forth them in sections to help me and to help everyone else. So I'm going to start with points and decision-making that therapists, practitioners, caseworkers, quote unquote mandated reporters, decision points where we invite surveillance in and where we have decision-making, we have important decisions to make and it is required for us to be thoughtful. I am then going to respond to a comment made a very long time ago, a question in the chat that was specific to the narrative of mandated reporters. I'm going to speak directly to that because I think it is very necessary for this conversation. And then I hope to get to a point where I can share an example of how we might utilize some of the tenets of liberation-focused healing, a framework that I have created in alignment with generations of wisdoms of folks across the country or all over the world into a praxis. We're gonna see how I do. I'm gonna try. Come on, stay with me. All right. So I think this is super important for us to get really grounded in where we are making decisions about inviting in surveillance and where surveillance lies. And this is true both inside systems where we are enacting harm reductionist practices, that is super important, outside systems where, I don't know if that's a thing, but outside sort of working within an institution where we might still be under some kind of control. And right here, I'm talking about licensed professionals that might be navigating spaces. And then we have folks that might completely decide, I am going to relinquish my affiliation with licensure because I am working in abolition. And so I want to begin by saying, I know I've began, but I'm going to add that it is super important to recognize that when someone steps into the role as a licensed professional, they are also disconnecting themselves from community. It requires us to have to other those we serve. That is why there are certain outlines around self-disclosure, which gets in the way of deep connection. So bearing that in mind, dance with me. Okay, so let's say I have had to number it. So first I have to contend with myself, right? How I receive information. For example, if I am at a supermarket and there is a person who is clearly frustrated, maybe they're knocking things over, and there's someone else in the building that knows that I'm there, knows who I am, and knows I am a social worker. I am responsible for doing what? Participating in the carcerality of our systems by reporting. There is certain information that I have to assess within myself about my own positioning as Shauna Murray Brown, my positioning as a Black woman, as an abolitionist, and as a licensed clinical social worker. Number two, super important that all practitioners are super clear about the difference between the code of conduct that guides their work and the code of ethics. Why is this important? Those two things are not the same. The code of ethics informs how a social worker, how a professional, and I'm speaking from a social work perspective. However, there are many other health and human service professionals that have these two different sort of guidelines around how they work. But the code of ethics guides what is expected of me for me to be able to call myself a social worker and not get in any trouble. and the code of conduct is legal. That means there are certain aspects, certain behaviors that if I do not follow the instruction, I can have my license revoked, or worse, a circumstance that happens in my presence, a circumstance where I was supposed to be made responsible. If I don't act in alignment with the particular code of conduct, I could be held, I could be punished, and punished just to make clear that the carceral system not only impacts, right, those of us that might be on the receiving end of services, but also those that are navigating, serving, and offering up said services. I'm not going to be able to go into all of this, all right, but I'm labeling it out so folks can have the eyes to see. Number 3, insurance. The decision to make your services more accessible by utilizing and getting on insurance panels, which means what? What kind of data is being gathered there, right? Basically everything. In order for a practitioner to be able to offer certain services and supports in a therapeutic setting, if they're accepting your insurance, they have to diagnose you, thereby placing a label on you and reporting all of this information to a larger system. Now, I'm not as versed as Yana and, you know, the multiplicity of the ways in which surveillance works. However, this is a large data system that feeds the medical industrial complex, that guides and supports and can be accessed, right? And then we're talking about the daily decisions that practitioners make around referral. That is, if I am holding space for someone, let's say I am their therapist, and I decide, oh, they need quote unquote anger management. Maybe this is mandated. I have to make a decision. Am I going to send them to the hospital where an anger management program is being provided, or am I going to call on the grassroots organization that already has certain things offered to be able to offer support holistically for this person, which requires a certain level of community connection. And number 5, the notes and records. On a day-to-day basis, the mantra within the human service sector is, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. That is, we are, in many settings, we are supposed to write every single thing down that is stated. And if we don't do that, we could be penalized. If we need support about how to offer, I used to work in a residential treatment center. If I needed support for my client, and I don't really like to use that term, but we're going to use it now. If I need supports for my client, then I need to ensure that the justification for the supports is in the record, right? But these all are also the same records that can be pulled in the court system, can be pulled from years later, right? I've had folks young folks who I served as their therapist that later ended up in the adult prison system, and they are still citing whatever notes that were written when they were in my care, right? So super important to recognize the range here. And then the last thing is the day-to-day decision-making of how we communicate, of who we're communicating with, of Lawanda in the chat put medical necessity. We have this burden of proof. And so I put that as a frame as I then go to this explanation of, well, why won't therapists and practitioners just decide not to participate in the mandated reporting? The question was sort of, do we need to illuminate this mandated reporting narrative? The first thing that I have to say here is that it is not a narrative. I wrote here, hold on. The mandatory reporting is a weight. It is the illusion of power. It's the illusion of power for the practitioner to have over the people in the space, is sort of like illusory, like the way that we might feel if a police officer is in the space. But it's also an illusion of power for the practitioner themselves, where they can get sort of in a sort of rendezvous with themselves about how much power they have over a certain individual. It is the manifestation of the creation of separation. So that is, if I'm a mandated reporter and you not, if you do something, I have to let you know that I have the ability to report. Yes, Selima.
This is Selima. Just want to remind you just to breathe as you're talking.
You're right. Thanks for that. And so the last thing is that it is not a narrative, it is a guideline. It is something that as a social worker who decides to maintain my license, it is something that hangs over my head on a day-to-day. And so there are a few things that I want to invite us as a collective and as practitioners to contend with about how we can navigate this space that really has an impact on really anyone's livelihood. If I didn't have my license, right, you probably wouldn't know who I was, right? I wouldn't be able to eat. I would not have access to certain resources. My skills might not be acknowledged within the space that I currently work. That isn't to say that those who decide to divest from licensure don't have those things. But for me, in my line of work, where I am standing at the intersection of liberation and reform, right? Where I'm trying to pull folks out of reformist thinking into liberatory works, I need my license in order to have a voice in those spaces. Likewise, many folks need some supports in those spaces. And so a couple of things. So the liberation-focused healing framework is a framework that came out of me seeking to navigate the child welfare system, working in sex abuse investigations, being really, really irritated in school as an MSW and presently as a doctoral candidate. It is something that I first embodied. And then when my community called me to share what it was that I was doing, I created the framework to articulate my day-to-day decision-making. So I'm going to share some of the components and some of the ways that we might apply it. I might not be able to share all of it, okay? And just for a note, I do provide a full-fledged training that Selima mentioned earlier, and that is decolonizing therapy for Black folks. Next month, we will be and have open enrollment, and I'll make sure that you all have the link, because I don't know if I'm going to get through all of this. But the major tenets of the liberation-focused healing framework is informed by the Black radical tradition, by liberation psychology, by African-centered psychology, by concepts of social identity development, and by wisdoms of ancient and traditional healing technology. What it would require, I was thinking about someone I hold dear that I held space for when he was 16 in a residential treatment center. We're going to call him Tristan, okay? So Tristan lived in the city of Baltimore. His mom struggled with addiction, and he often got in fights in school and was found selling drugs on the corner in the city of Baltimore. His introduction to surveillance happened at both sites, the school system with the social worker there and the police who on the corner in the neighborhood that he lived. And so after several incidences where they were tracking him, talking to his grandma, trying to address these things, he eventually ended up being arrested. They moved him into a residential treatment center. Their statement was he could not be managed safely in the home. What it looked like for Tristan in my care was he went to the school for residential treatment, and I was his therapist. He often would break things. He would throw things at the white folks in the system. I would be called to de-escalate. Some of the decision-making that I had to make is an example of liberation-focused healing within a system. An example, when there was basically a way that he had to navigate himself in order to get permission to go home, to leave the location. What I would do is allow a space for the use of hip hop and writing in the therapeutic space, in our private space. He could cuss, he could scream. I had a pillow with boxing gloves where he could hit, as long as we had some understanding about what was considered safe and allowable. That is an example of utilizing his own cultural orientation to support him in being able to put his own experiences into words. The most important thing that I will say about that is, as he was able to engage in those spaces, it was important for me to connect his grandma to grassroots political organizing outside of the institution. So I might be advocating for Tristan inside the institution, but I needed grandma to be able to cultivate the political prowess to be able to navigate and advocate for herself and her grandson outside of the institution. So because I could not do that, I was like, Grandma, don't you want to go and connect to this institution over here? And I encouraged her to go and so that she could raise her own critical consciousness. And the only other thing that I'm going to add, because I'm pretty sure I don't have no more time, is super important that practitioners do this rooted village cultivation, a major tenet in the liberation-focused healing framework. That is where you connect with your people in community, not as a volunteer, not as a helper, not hi, my name is Shauna Mary Brown, LCSWC, but as a genuine connection with folks in communion. And so to learn more about that, connect with me later. I'm finished.
Oh, thank you so much, Shauna. This is Selima, and I highly encourage folks to check out Therapy That Liberates and Decolonizing Therapy for Black folks, because it is enlightening and heartening as someone working within systems. And I think is also helpful for those of us working outside of systems. I'm super conscious of time and want to honor the closing time that we've promised you all. And so just saying out loud to the panelists that we will actually skip the last couple of questions and move into closing. I invite all the panelists and our audience members to our community to share if there are any people, movement, art, music, or stories you'd like to uplift as we close this space. If you can please drop it in the chat. And I'm going to pass it to Jessie to share some exciting news of a new series that is being launched by IDHA. I just want to extend some deep gratitude to everyone who is here this evening, to the organizers and facilitators, and please stay tuned for Jessie's exciting announcement. Thank you all.
Thank you, Selima, and thank you so much, everybody, for the conversation. A lot to think about. I definitely am feeling that we were pushed up against time here, but looking forward to keeping the conversation going and, like I said, saving the comments that I see coming in from the panelists here. So if we could put up the slide, Frankie, we do have a really exciting announcement. If folks have a couple of minutes here, I'll just pause while we wait for that to come up. Seeing all the gratitude and energy in the chat here. Thank you, great. So really excited to share that we have just launched IDHA's Fall 2022 and Spring 2023 virtual training series. I want to just uplift a whole lot of gratitude to the training committee at IDHA who put in so much love and intention and care to make this series possible. Crossroads of Crisis, Dreams and Strategies for Collective Care. You can visit the link that's going to be dropped in the chat. Part of why I'm really excited to share this all with you, and you can go to the next slide, Frankie, is a lot of the threads from tonight's conversation are going to continue to be woven into what we're going to be talking about over the next 8 months in this training series, which is the longest virtual series that we've ever organized. We're going to be going from November to June. And just to read a few of the themes from this slide, we have the crisis industry, how capitalism, cops, and coercion shape care today. We have building communities to meet crisis and resourcing our relationships, creating a crisis toolkit, reorienting to emergency, and a lived experience showcase at the end. So wanting to keep this brief, but to just share the excitement, especially because of this building the web of what we're doing tonight. We'll go to the next slide. Like I said, the links are in the chat. Registration is open and will be open on a rolling basis. The first class isn't until November 13th. That said, we have a really exciting early bird special. Because this class is so long, which we're excited about, we wanted to give you some options with registration. And so we're offering early bird for the first time. If you use the code EARLY10 in capitals, you can save an additional 10% on a full series registration. That is going for the next week. And if you register in the first week, we're excited that you can tap into, if you're interested, a bundle of self-paced courses from our last two series, Crisis as Catalyst and Cultivating Community. So if we go to the next slide, just to give you a preview, Crisis as Catalyst had classes like Grounding in Grief and Making Sanctuary as Decolonial Practice, Ancestral Healing. Those are already available, but if you tap this early bird, you can get them all included if you don't already have them. And then we've just finished adapting our spring 2022 series, Cultivating Community. So you can also get those included as well. So that I think all the details will be in the chat for you, but just a final note on this for now to say, yeah, a lot of thought and care has gone into creating this, and we would be super honored to have you join us for one class, a couple of classes, or the entire series. We did it, design it very intentionally as a series, and it's going to be a beautiful, rich learning journey from now into next summer. So with that, I think there's one more slide. Yeah, just in terms of event follow-up, you will get a follow-up email from us in the next couple of days that will have the recording of this event, links to all of the resources from this chat, including all the resources that you all shared to further enrich our conversation here, and ways to stay in touch with IDA and your panelists. So you can tag us on social media, keep up with us on the socials. But I think just in closing, we can take down the slide, and I want to just mention again, gratitude. It's hard to, I'm going to switch my screen to gallery here so I can see everyone. Encourage folks who want to turn their video on and can. I want to thank Selima, our moderator, our amazing panelists, for this super, super rich conversation that's going to have me thinking for the rest of the night and week and thereafter about these conversations. Our access team, we had an incredible team of ASL interpreters and our captioners, and all of the organizers of the Decarcerating Care Committee. I think some of y'all are here, people who've been on these panels, all of you who've been building. It's really beautiful to see these conversations happening ongoing for a few years now. So just an invitation to stay in dialogue and community with you all. And till next time, thank you.